I'm Amanda Smith, and you're watching For Art's Sake. Hi, I'm Amanda Smith. I'm a painter who is interested in landscape, and particularly the back and forth between how environment shapes culture and how culture shapes environment. I currently live in Bloomington, Indiana, where I teach at Indiana University in painting, and I'm happy to be here participating in the Great Outdoors exhibition at Parkland College. So the body of work in this exhibition comes from work that I made directly following the COVID-19 pandemic. Following lockdown, I spent a lot of time in my backyard and in neighborhood environments, as well as in nature preserves and historical preserves and parks in my community. And the process of being kind of isolated from typical day-to-day activities sort of upset my worldview enough that I really began paying attention to nature in different ways. Up to this point, landscape and environment had always been an important part of my painting practice and always subject matter in my work. But I used it up to that point almost as a way to discover new things, kind of like traveling vicariously. So switching my view to the ground directly beneath me and my own backyard was kind of a big shakeup in my practice. So these particular works are focusing on kind of small events, small disruptions, small changes that would occur in my immediate environment. And I started thinking about them through like a mythological lens, sort of developing a backyard mythology of sorts. This painting is called Unless We Close Our Eyes, We Can't Find Where We Used to Be Anywhere. And I borrowed the title of this painting from a poem by Eric Campbell that basically is talking a bit about the sort of rift and dichotomy and sometimes contentious nature between technology and human myth. And this is something that I think is a really big part of many people's experience during the pandemic. So in this case, this is a scene of a regular activity I would engage with in my backyard during this time period, which is the backyard campfire. But I thought about perspective in this painting in a somewhat atypical way for myself. So I'm imagining myself almost from kind of a drone view and creating this sort of mirroring that occurs between the chairs on one side of the fire pit and the chairs on the other side of the fire pit. So if you look at this painting, you might notice that the chairs are kind of like the same set in reverse, the table's the same. So what I hope someone kind of gleans from this work is maybe a question about, are we looking at a singular setup where maybe 4 people are involved, or are we looking at a reflection? Are we looking at something that is a first-person experience, or is this something seen sort of remotely or from maybe a digital vantage point? And I think I've made some choices in the kind of painting language and the mark making that I'm using here that I hope also kind of points to the back and forth between sort of physical, natural world experiences, imagined experiences, and then digital experiences. So maybe kind of the breakup of these shapes here have both a painterly look and I think at times look like some type of digital degradation, right? Something that's sort of coming into place or falling apart, like pixelization. This particular painting, which is called Mountains, is a painting of molehills from my backyard. So the immediate title kind of references blowing things out of proportion, right? Or imagining something worse than it actually is. And I, at the time, was living at a house that was on an acre of land, and I mowed the lawn with a push mower, spent a lot of time looking at this grass. So I would see a lot of these molehills, and they didn't on their own upset me, but they kind of like, I don't know, served almost as a metaphor for a kind of unsettlement that I felt in that particular environment. So I lived in an area of Springfield, Missouri that was right near a Civil War battlefield and was along a wire road, which was a major communication and transportation pathway west at that time, and was also aligned with the Trail of Tears. So there was a lot of kind of historical movement and upset and activity in that area that felt largely unresolved. So there was something about kind of seeing these disruptions in the earth that felt related in some capacity to that. So I think of this kind of as a mundane metaphor for those things. Well, so this painting is called The Birds, and this came about actually after I had moved to Bloomington, Indiana. So Bloomington is kind of known, I guess, by people who live there for these very large flocks of starlings and crows that will congregate like on the main town square, fly over campus. They're really quite large. So they got my car really good one day, and it was the weekend before Inauguration Day. So I just kind of had some internal feelings that made me feel like poo kind of was an urgent political problem. So I decided to make a painting out of this. And with this painting, it's kind of just like tongue-in-cheek and fun, right? So it's a response to kind of like just a dumb thought that I had, but turned into something that was really about like surface treatment. So when you're making a painting, you're typically working on a flat surface, and if you're trying to depict space, you're trying to create an illusion, right? So in this case, I was looking at a flat surface, a windshield, but it's something that is transparent, that I can see through. But the bird poop was there to kind of disrupt that illusion. So in the painting, I kind of like physically made the bird poop off of the canvas. So I made it on like a palette paper so I could peel it off and then kind of place it. Or I had to think through different ways, like how do you make a splatter that doesn't look like paint, but that, you know, looks like poop? Or that looks the way that it does when you see light shining from two directions, you know, the interior dome light in your car versus the headlights versus the light in the parking lot, right? So kind of thinking about these different lighting conditions. And since this was, you know, late January, in the rearview mirror, there was one of those like parking lot icebergs. And I just, seeing that, I couldn't help but thinking of, you know, like the Titanic or something where we see something in retrospect and yet we're headed towards it again, like by choice. So this is kind of maybe an anomaly within this group of paintings. This painting is a diptych, so it's two canvases, but they function together as one painting. And it's called Summer Crush. And this also came about during lockdown and the period that immediately followed it. So this wasn't directly from my backyard, but from neighborhood walks that I would take. I had a specific route that I would often walk. And I noticed that there was someone who used that route, like I guess as their drinking route, because there was like a really particular brand of light beer that I would see the sort of empty cans as litter on this route, and it would change a little bit. So I could also see how frequently someone was using this route. And there was just something funny about like seeing this word natural kind of crop up in that environment over and over. But I also started thinking about it as this is a way that I was kind of communicating with another person at a time when we couldn't communicate together in physical space. So using these objects as kind of like a projection or a way of mirroring or seeing someone else or reflecting upon someone else's habits felt strangely important at that time period. So this is also a device that I just ended up using quite a bit for a couple of years in my work. So thinking about mirroring or twinning. So noticing moments when that occurred in natural space and being drawn to those particular circumstances, like seeing, conjoined oak trees that were growing together as a pair, noticing or kind of playing around with the idea of reflection and inversion with these two cans, or as I talked about earlier in the backyard fire pit painting, the kind of mirroring and maybe like slight trickery of whether we're seeing 4 chairs or 2 chairs, whether it's an actual situation or a reflection of a situation. The summer crush was kind of thinking about, like relationships. Obviously this wasn't in any way romantic, but just the idea that you're sort of like thinking about someone when they're not there. I have no idea who this someone was, so I kind of used that idea. I had also just bought some like pink hydrangeas that were called Summer Crush. I think that's where this color came from. The yellow, I can't remember why I elected that particular color, other than I think I was just excited about not matching this particular company's brand precisely, right? Just riffing on it. And then maybe just thinking through like color relationships of that seasonal change, and something that just felt like high key and kind of synthetic, something kind of golden, something warm, but maybe like a little eerie at the same time. So this painting, which is called Nature Center, is kind of a newer track in my work. So this is a direction that my work is headed. This is still coming from the same community that I lived in during the pandemic, but this is centered more on the type of park spaces and public preserves of nature that crop up in towns. So my partner and I went on a night hike in the Springfield Nature Center. And I had done this following a night hike experience that I had in Quebec. And I went with a forest guide. We didn't use any type of flashlight, and our eyes just adjusted, and it was kind of a wonderful experience. So we were trying to emulate that, and I'm not sure what happened, if it was because this nature preserve was within the city, so there was kind of that umbrella of ambient city light, but our eyes never did adjust. So we were without lights and kind of wandering through this nature center on trails, mostly from memory. And we heard this really large clattering sound and kind of felt reverberations, and there was this just awful kind of musk and chemical fear smell. So all of those sort of sensory inputs were telling us that something large was kind of moving towards us, but we couldn't see it, right? And it took several seconds, which felt like much longer than that, for our eyes to start to piece together the silhouette of a buck. So I was interested in painting this experience, and really I wanted to think a lot more about just kind of the wild fear of not being able to confirm your senses, but I couldn't figure out how to make a painting of something that you can't see. So I made this instead, which is maybe referencing trail cam kind of technology, or the tropes or the types of color situations that you might see in those circumstances, and our interest in sort of like knowing what happens at night, or maybe being able to kind of control what happens at night, but being at a remove from it. But I was thinking about a particular painting by Albert Bierstadt that is in the Sheldon Museum of Art in Lincoln, Nebraska. And it's this painting of a landscape with kind of like a little bank in front of a river, I believe. And if you look at it closely, you can see there's a spot where he did have a deer painted in, and he elected to paint it out. So it just remains this like kind of hovered, or this ghost image. And it's something that you really have to search for, or you have to look at the painting multiple times to get to know that. So that kind of was just in the back of my head as I was painting this image. I don't know that I like quite hit the spot I wanted to in terms of hiding and revealing that deer. There's just a ton of glazing on this painting. I typically might start with acrylic and then quickly move to oil. The acrylic, I think, is just to get some ideas flowing, but I feel like I don't have as much finesse in acrylic. But this has, you know, like 20, 30 layers of glaze to kind of push that deer back. So the acrylic allowed me to do that in, you know, less than 3 years. So I really think a lot through color, and I kind of like high key color, really garish color, but I want it to be something that like can shift back and forth between being on the edge of something natural and being something that's exaggerated. In this case, the entire scene is invented, right? So this wasn't something that I saw, it was something that I kind of experienced through other senses. So I had to make a lot of it up. So there are some references. So I just looked at a lot of different images of trail cam photography, and you'll see memes going around too of like trail cam glitches, where you see a deer that appears to like have 3 heads, and you know, there's these like haunted, spooky, like really exciting images. So I'm looking at those. There are also like trail cam technologies and filters, you know, and they have funny names like Tacticam and Color the Night. So I was looking at, you know, what kinds of colors, they honestly look like hand-tinted black and white photography, right? So that was really interesting to me, but I did kind of start to fuse like a couple of situations together. So the deer was one situation, but a few months later we were on that trail, and we saw like a copperhead snake that was up on this manicured railing and just kind of sitting there, like looking at us, waiting for us, like it wanted to be seen, and it felt almost like an omen of sorts. So I included that in there. The space doesn't quite make sense because I wanted something that indicated the density of walking through that landscape, especially at night when you couldn't quite see things, so you're more feeling things. And maybe the idea of like a little bit of an obstacle course. The trees I kind of set up, this wasn't intentional, but I thought about it after the fact. There's a book that I was reading probably a year before this that had a crop of a Gustave Doré print on it that had these 2 trees kind of flanking either side of the cover. And I think that just kind of happened instinctually, and it probably did come from that book in some way, some memory of that. But I also wanted to think of them as like a portal of sorts, or a doorway. And again, maybe some of that reflection or twinning.